It feels like we talk about Zack Palansky most weeks that I do this show. But that's not overkill. I promise, not what you think about it. After all, the Greens now have over 175,000 members and regularly poll second and even third, sometimes with credible pollsters. Last week, in just 24 hours, the party raised more money after a fundraising video went viral than they did for the first half of 2025. They raised more money in one day than in 6 months. The campaign for that is called Hope is Here. The crowdfunder so far has raised £215,000, with the stretch goal being £250,000. That's a decent pot for local elections next May. But last week had its downs as well as its ups for the Green Party leader. Appearing on the Rest is Politics podcast alongside Rory Stewart and Alistair Campbell, Palansky arguably came unstuck a few times. First up, his question regarding how much Britain pays as interest on its public debt.
How much are we spending every year on debt interest?
So actually, of all people, Richard Tice has been saying the same thing. During COVID, we gave loans to the Bank of England.
You can't give me a rough figure on how much we're spending on debt interest every year?
Well, there's £70 billion that we owe to the Bank of England, but we don't actually owe that money.
You mean the debt or the deficit?
The debt.
Okay, the debt is
the deficit,
bigger.
sorry.
Okay, we are spending £100 billion annually on debt interest, right?
Is it 11% of everything?
Debt interest, huge amount of money.
Right.
So one of the things I suppose I'm getting at
but what I'm getting straight back at you is we don't need to spend that money. So that money has been created as an idea. We're spending that money straight back to ourselves.
This is my point about the change. We do need to spend that money now because that is how we borrow the money from the markets to fund the things that we're funding. And so one of the reasons why, and I know you're not happy with the sort of economic performance and the performance more generally of the Labour government, one of the reasons why they do have to be conscious of the market reaction to something like a budget is because if they get it wrong, the markets lose confidence and the costs of borrowing then go further and we end up spending even more. So that's why I keep saying, how do you get from A to B?
Well, and so now we're really getting to the root of the question. I think it comes to all of what Rory was just saying, because I think we're operating in different paradigms.
Strange answer. And we're not going to criticize Zack in this conversation. Strange answer. Rory Stewart is right that the interest on public debt in this country is 100 billion plus. It has been for multiple years. I'm not talking about the deficit. The deficit is also 100 billion plus. That's different to the debt interest that we're paying. So imagine you've got your overdraft. That's the equivalent of the national debt. And you're paying interest every year on your overdraft. That's the interest. And the deficit might be, how much worse that's getting on a monthly basis or an annual basis. We'll talk about all of those points in a minute. But Zack, I think, should acknowledge that 100 billion is far too much for debt interest. And there's a very easy way to rectify this, by the way. To not run deficits. Very simple, right? Very simple way to not be worried about what the bank thinks of you if you're not having to take credit from it. It's become a left-coded idea that we have to run deficits. Now, I'm not opposed to deficits. I don't think we have to run surpluses, but it's also not the more deficits and the higher the deficits, the more left-wing you are. I don't think that's sensible. China doesn't do that. Right? This country, at its peak, at its apogee of social democracy, didn't do that. Western Europe, actually, when it was far more equitable than it is today, and the state had a far larger role, they weren't all running deficits all the time. Okay, France, West Germany, etc. They weren't running deficits. So the idea that running deficits is necessarily left-wing, big mistake. You can say, I think, as a socialist, well, I don't think deficits should be that high. Sure, public debt shouldn't be that high. The idea that, again, the more left-wing you are, the higher the public debt. Completely wrong way around. Later in the conversation, Palansky was asked about his intellectual influences and his favourite economists.
I'm not an economist. I'm not going to pretend to be an economist. What I am, though, is someone who listens to brilliant economists and a whole range of economists and listens to ideas from around the world. And what I know is that our system is broken. It's not working for anyone. Sorry, it's not working for anyone. It's working for multimillionaires and billionaires who are telling the story about our system.
So, rather than getting into maybe an argument about this,
it's fine. You told me like 20 minutes ago that I wasn't radical enough.
Tell us which economists you're listening to. Who are your intellectual influences here?
Brilliant people. So Grace Blakely, Richard Murphy, who's been doing a lot of work on this, Gary Stevenson, who I know you've had on recently, James Meadway.
All friends of the show. And of course, that got a lot of pickup. Lots of people were attacking Zack Palansky for saying those people. They're saying, well, they're not economists. I mean, James Meadway is. He did a PhD in economics. But, Gary Stevenson, fine, a trader. Grace, she's worked in consulting and think tank stuff, but, fine. She's not an academic or an economist working for a major financial institution. But there are very, very, very august, significant economists who agree with them. Gabriel Zuckman in France, very influential. Thomas Piketty, very influential. Really serious people. Joseph Stiglitz, Nobel Prize winner. Mariana Mazzucato. She was very good friends with some people around Keir Starmer before the last election. So the idea that by arguing and advocating for a wealth tax, no serious economist is doing it. It's just people like Gary Stevenson, who's a very successful author, or Grace Blakely, who's a very successful writer, podcaster, but no serious economists are actually saying this. No, they are. Right? They really are. And just because he didn't come to it like that straight away doesn't mean that that isn't the case. Very, very serious people, Nobel Prize winners, have argued for this. So don't sort of disparage it as something that only a few people with Mickey Mouse blogs are saying. And by the way, Richard Murphy's an accountant. He's not an economist. I think that gives him more credibility, frankly. If somebody was coming to me and they said, I'm an academic macroeconomist at Cambridge, and I think this and this and this about tax avoidance, I'd say, okay, great. If a guy is saying, look, I'm an accountant from Norwich, and I've been working with small and medium-sized businesses for 30 years, and I know all the rules they break and bend to minimize their tax take, and here's what we can do to increase tax revenues in this country by tens of billions of pounds a year. Guess what? I'm going to listen to the accountant. I don't care what university he went to. I don't care what letters are after his name, or whether he's part of the permanent political and media class in this country. I don't care. Park that for a moment. As I've said, very august, significant political figures and economists back a wealth tax, but equally, that's not the whole story anyway. I've got a line here before I go on from Politico Teacher. The UK has almost always ran deficits, and so has every other state Aaron just talked about. He's just wrong. That's not true. Britain has been running permanent deficits basically since neoliberalism. Unless you think neoliberalism is good, which I don't, then we have to revisit that. Britain ran surpluses throughout the entire post-war period, all the way through the early 1980s. The only years that this country has run surpluses, really since Thatcher went into office in 1979, were a couple of years under John Major and a couple of years under Brown Blair. So really over, 45 years, 4 or 5 years, we've been running surpluses. So it's very fair to say, as this chap is, I presume, saying, that we generally run deficits. That's true, but that's an outgrowth of American imperialism and neoliberalism. Okay? When you go back to the golden age of social democracy in Europe, which, by the way, I don't think we can go back to for a ton of reasons, but when you go back to it, that wasn't the case. So this idea that we can just run infinity deficits and have infinity public debt, it's at odds with historic socialist politics and arguments made in this country and elsewhere, of course, like China, as I just said. After speaking to Zack Palansky, the two hosts made some concluding remarks about the conversation. Here's what Rory Stewart had to say.
I was horrified beyond belief on the economic stuff. It's not acceptable. Guy's got almost 20% of the vote in some of these polls, right? He could be part of a coalition government. I stopped calling him out on things because it got so mad. But listeners paying attention, right? He didn't know at all how much we're paying on debt interest. £100 billion a year we're spending on debt. It's twice as much we spend on defense. He needs to know that. Number two, he doesn't know the difference between the debt and the deficit. Right, just to explain for most listeners, right, just in case other people are not. And so, am I being rude to listeners in having to explain this? I presume most of our listeners know, right? The debt is the total amount you've borrowed. The deficit is the amount you're adding to it every year. Thinking that our debt is 70 billion rather than our deficit is underestimating the scale of our debt about 15-fold. Right? And then he didn't know what the top rate of tax was. So, the fact that he's talking about changing taxes when he doesn't know the top rate of tax. I didn't even call him out on that. He said it was 40% rather than 45%. Right? Is it too much to ask that if you're proposing to be leader of a party, and he said to me afterwards, "Oh, you were very unfair. I wasn't ready for those questions. I'm an actor, and I can get up on those things. And if I'd had a bit more warning, For goodness sake, he's claiming to reshape our entire economy. He's got your entire family WhatsApp group going out there saying, let's vote Green. We don't want to go with Labour.
You can't make assumptions about my family WhatsApp group.
And at least 20,
they say things like, I quite like this Zack Palansky
20%
guy.
of the British public, right? And his economic advisor is Yanis Varoufakis.
I thought.
I mean, so I didn't want to be. I mean, obviously, it got a bit scratchy there. And normally I reserve my scratchiness for the Michael Goves of this world. But this is not good enough. This is not serious enough. If this is where British politics is going, no.
Well,
his advisor was Yanis Varoufakis. Well, you were just saying that he wasn't informed by actual economists. Yanis Varoufakis wrote the book. He wrote the book on game theory that undergraduate economist students get. He wrote the book. They're not real economists. Okay, how about this dude that wrote a book about game theory? No, he magically doesn't count either. I'm thinking it's not just about whether or not they're economists. This guy doesn't even know what the top rate of tax is. He doesn't even know the difference between the deficit and the debt. Rory Stewart became an MP in 2010 when the Tories formed a government. David Cameron was Prime Minister. David Cameron went on the Tonight Show in the United States. He was asked, and this is not a lie, Google this, YouTube it. YouTube the shit out of it. What does Magna Carta mean in English? He didn't know. The Prime Minister of the United Kingdom of Great Britain and Northern Ireland. All that money wasted on his Eton education. He didn't know. Do you really think that all those Tory MPs knew the difference between the debt, the deficit, debt interest? I don't believe they did because they made such a horrific bodge job of the economy after they got in. This is the same chap who was in a government whose chancellor was George Osborne, who oversaw an economy where debt to GDP, which is to say the public debt was 60% of the overall economy, debt to GDP was 60%. They said we have to get rid of the deficit, we have to get the debt down. And guess what? Fast forward 2025, public debt is 100% of GDP. They said by 2015, we're going to eliminate the deficit. 5 years later, it's still there. They destroyed the public realm in this country, including things like the Crown Prosecution Service, including things like the prison estate, youth services, triple tuition fees, defund the NHS, defund local authorities. If you walk around your local area now and it kind of looks crappy and you think, wow, it looked a lot nicer 15 years ago, it's because local authorities have been defunded. They've lost about 40 to 50% of their funding over the last 15 years. And that happened with these guys, with Rory Stewart. And he's horrified. I'm horrified of you. I'm horrified of what you did in government, your record. Not what you will do, not what you could do, not what you said on some stupid, pointless interview. Ultimately, it's just words, isn't it? What you did, your record, I'm horrified. It's a big word, horrified. Horror. Horror. I am filled with horror with your record in government. And the truth is, these guys are trying to milkshake duck Zack Palansky. Again, it goes back to the logics of the media. Fear sells. Polarization sells. Hatred sells. Rather than say, you know what? Okay, he didn't say the right people, but it's true. When it comes to a wealth tax, there are very, very significant economists calling for this. They could have said that. If they cared about informing their audience, they could have said that. But they don't. Because it's not about informing anybody. It's about getting your way, about being right. I'm right, he's wrong. If you were so right, why the hell were you working in the Cameron government in 2010 if you're always so right? Maybe, Rory, you're a little bit dumb. Just a little bit. Maybe sometimes you're wrong about stuff. No, I can't be wrong. I was the deputy governor of a province in Iraq. Was that a good idea too? I'm horrified. The man was a literal deputy governor of a province in southern Iraq during the Second Gulf War. I'm horrified. Thanks for letting us know. Kieran, what did you think of Zack's performance on The Rest is Politics?
Well, first of all, let me say there is nothing I find more inspiring than the falsetto tones of an incredulous Rory Stewart. That's the first thing, I think, most important thing. No, I mean, you made the points very well, Aaron. It is pretty astonishing to have Rory Stewart slinging economic mud at Zack Palansky. Now, look, in an ideal world, Zack Palansky would have been a bit sharper on the distinction between the deficit and the debt. In an ideal world, he would have been a bit clearer on the top rate of tax, and he would have been able to name a few contemporary economists, for example, the ones you've named, and a few historical economists. He could have just said Keynes. Keynes is way to the left of anything we see or have today in the mainstream. So he could have said those and passed Rory Stewart's stupid test with flying colours. Nonetheless, those are kind of superficial or cosmetic points. As you said, Rory Stewart was part of a government that was, I think, the most catastrophically economically illiterate government in maybe 60 or 70 years, even more so than Thatcher. I think Thatcher did more harm to the British economy, structurally speaking, over time. But I think Osborneomics was the greatest missed opportunity for the British economy in the post-war period. And actually, as a result of that, the single most expedient agent of British decline, actually. I really, really believe that. And for Rory Stewart to be in a government that refused to borrow when interest rates were zero, something that basically never happens and probably won't happen again, certainly not for a very, very long time, if ever, is completely insane. I mean, it's completely insane whether you're a fiscal hawk or big on deficit spending. It was an act of intergenerational economic vandalism. There's no two ways about it. And I think I've even heard Tories saying, that was a missed opportunity. That was a golden opportunity that we missed, and it was a bad thing. And the reason we missed it was because the deficit and the debt were used so effectively as scarecrows. And so I guess to come back to your point, Aaron, you're right about, it's not ideal to be paying 108, I think it's the figure, 108 billion pounds, at least it was in 2024, 108 billion pounds just servicing the debt, just paying the interest on the debt. Of course, that's not ideal. I think the overall debt is 2.3 trillion, something like that. You want to get those figures down, of course you would, over time, but not at the expense of investment and not at the expense of public services. And I think that speaks to a very core thing about this entire discussion that we're having, and the discussion that Rory Stewart attempted to have with Zack Palansky, which is that deficit spending is a legitimate form of economic management. It's core to Keynesianism. It's absolutely core to Keynesianism. That the worst thing you could do when your economy goes into a downturn period, as it did after 2008, the worst thing you could do is to completely cut back, and for there to be a complete seizing of the supply line of money and investment into the economy. It ends up becoming a vicious cycle, and I think it's a very large part of the explanation as to why the economy has grown in such a lukewarm way over the past 15 years. Now, of course, as I say, ultimately you want to get the spending down, but when the deficit or the debt becomes scarecrows, which caution against investment per se, that's when the problem starts. And the reason, I think it's important to say, the reason that in the 1960s and 70s, the UK didn't run surpluses. I mean, there are various things that were going on in the global economy which make it different to today. But one thing is that the wealthy paid a much higher rate of tax. So the return for the Treasury was higher relative to the other sum total of goods and services in the economy and so on. And that makes a huge difference. The problem now is that so much money is squirreled away. The tax rate has been retrenched to such a degree that governments resort to borrowing because they don't think that they can politically, feasibly recover sufficient funds to keep public services in a complex population growth, pro-population growth society with taxes alone. And so there's a balance there between the two forms in which, or ways in which governments can raise money. That's an important, significant part of the equation here. So yeah, the Rory Stewart is completely discredited on the economy. And I think what this speaks to is Rory Stewart's continual error, which is that he thinks that, careful, technocratic, being across the detail, and ultimately tinkering around the edges is the way to save all societies and to save Britain. People are really hurting, not in small part because of Rory Stewart's former government's policies. They want visionary politics. Of course, they're sensible. They want it grounded in empirical truths and empirical reality, but they want something that breaks with the consensus that Rory Stewart has been such a pivotal figure in.
There's a comment saying that you should go on onto one of these podcasts alongside Zack Palansky next time as wingman. I'm inclined to agree. Look, this is something that I think people really need to understand. It was very cheap for the government to borrow for most of the 2010s, right? Now, if you're a market capitalist, if you believe in free markets, a price is information. It's a signal, okay? When the price of borrowing for a state is so low, that is a signal from the market saying, borrow the money, invest it in revenue generating things. We can't find many good bets over there out there more broadly for returns. We're willing to borrow to states because there's so much risk elsewhere. Returns are so low. We want a steady, stable thing to invest in. The returns aren't great, but we know we'll get them. Hence, we're going to borrow to you. You're a good bet. It's a signal. It's a piece of information. That's why borrowing is so cheap. Do it. But we had a media and political class in this country, and particularly that government, who were too thick. They have no idea what they're talking about. If you believe in this stuff, if you believe in prices as an expression of information, you would draw that conclusion. They have no idea what they're talking about, right? Dan Wang puts this so well. He says, China has the engineering state. America has the lawyer state. Britain has the PPE state, okay? It's just a bunch of bluffers who basically, look at this stuff as an exercise in marketing and PR. They don't have a substantial knowledge of what they're talking about. And yet one of those very people, like Rory Stewart, is, castigating and slamming Zack Palansky. In addition, the thing about deficits is really key. Keynes says you can use deficits and you can borrow to increase final demand as a counter-cyclical stimulus. When the economy is not growing, you can make it grow by running deficits. The problem we now have in the West since neoliberalism is that deficits are not a counter-cyclical stimulus. We are running deficits all of the time, permanently. And a lot of that is actually, as you've said, to basically have a low-tax economy. That's why we're running all these deficits. It's not a coincidence, right? So you don't have to have high tax rates on wealth. Often we have deficit-funded tax cuts. In the United States, the Clinton administration ran a surplus, again, very unusual in the post-1970s landscape. What happens? George W. Bush gets in, they run a deficit straight away. Why? Tax cuts for the rich. So this idea that, the more the deficits, the bigger, the more left-wing you are, not true. And I'll finish with this as well. We need some more Keynes. Going back to that first clip of this podcast, these guys do not view John Maynard Keynes as a legitimate economist. He was, without any shadow of a doubt, the most influential economist in the world easily until 1980. Easily. But now it's like he's some random guy who's illegitimate, has no role in public debate. Even Adam Smith. Read Adam Smith. Adam Smith is so far to the left of mainstream economics debate in this country. And again, they have no idea because they did PPE. It's not real. It's not real.
If you asked Rory Stewart, who are your intellectual forebears? Who are your kind of market economy inspirations? He would probably, I'm sure he'd be able to name some. He'd probably say Hayek. He'd maybe say Milton Friedman, maybe von Mises. In any of those individuals, key kind of luminaries of free market capitalism in one form or another, you could absolutely pick empirical holes all the way through them. So this idea that there are these unimpeachable economic thinkers in history and at present, and then there are these kind of pie in the sky thinkers. So much of what Milton Friedman, who's the latter day godfather of free market economics, so much of what he wrote was absolutely pie in the sky and only proven so decisively after the financial crisis, by the way, conveniently 2 years after he died. Anyway, just a final observation.
And also, by the way, as a general rule, when somebody says, this person, it's ridiculous, it means I haven't actually got a thought out, coherent critique of that person or that argument, which I'm capable of explaining to you. So I'm just going to do some grunt